Somewhere in the cypress swamps of Louisiana, there exists a sealed archive that the church has never acknowledged. 12 birth certificates, all dated between 1847 and 1852, each bearing the same father's name, a man who was property, not a person. The Vatican received a letter in October 1852 that was immediately classified under the highest level of secrecy, a designation reserved for matters that could shake the foundations of faith itself. Witnesses reported that when the Archbishop of New Orleans opened the package containing evidence from the Convent of the Sacred Mercy, he wept openly for 3 hours before ordering every document burned. Yet somehow fragments survived in private collections, in faded journals, in whispered testimonies recorded by those who couldn't bear to let such truth disappear into silence. The official position remains that the convent simply closed due to financial difficulties. But the 12 women who took their vows there vanished from all church records on the same November night, as if they had never existed at all. Before we continue with the story of the Sacred Mercy Convent and the man whose existence the church tried to erase, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from Louisiana, from anywhere in the Deep South, or from any corner of this country where hidden histories still whisper through the walls of old buildings, leave a comment telling me where you're from. This channel survives because of listeners like you who hunger for the truth that history tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has never been told in full, and stories like this deserve to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel. The truth about what happened at Sacred Mercy didn't begin with scandal. It began with what the people of St. Landry Parish believed to be an act of uncommon charity. St. Martinville sat like a pearl of French civilization in the humid embrace of the Teche country, 23 mi south of Opelousas, where the Bayou Teche wound through sugar plantations and cypress groves thick enough to swallow the afternoon sun. The town had been established by French aristocrats fleeing the Revolution, and by 1842, it maintained a stubborn European elegance despite the Louisiana heat that wilted collars and turned imported silk to ruin. The central square boasted the Church of St. Martin Detour. Its steeple was visible for miles across the flat delta landscape, a beacon of Catholic faith in a region where voodoo drums sometimes echoed from the slave quarters after midnight and where French, English, Spanish, and Creole mixed into a linguistic stew that confused outsiders. 3 mi north of town, accessible only by a narrow shell road that turned to impossible mud during the rainy season, stood the Convent of the Sacred Mercy. The building had been erected in 1838 by Madame Celeste Dufosa, a childless widow whose sugar fortune had grown so vast that she sought to purchase her way into heaven through conspicuous piety. The convent was intended to house a small community of teaching sisters who would educate the daughters of wealthy planters while offering Christian instruction to slave children on Sundays, a progressive notion for the time, though one that stopped well short of suggesting that black children and white should share the same classroom or the same catechism. The structure itself was built in the West Indies style, raised on brick piers to combat flooding, with wide galleries on both floors that caught whatever breeze might stir the thick air. Madame Dufosa had insisted on French windows that opened floor to ceiling, on plaster walls painted a cool yellow that reminded her of Provence, on a chapel with stained glass shipped from Lyon at tremendous expense. The surrounding grounds encompassed 12 acres of gardens, kitchen plots, a small cemetery surrounded by an iron fence, and at the far edge of the property, hidden behind a screen of live oaks draped in Spanish moss, a cluster of dependencies. Kitchen, laundry, storage buildings, and quarters for the 3 slaves who maintained the property. By 1845, the convent housed exactly 12 sisters, all under the age of 35, all from respectable French and Creole families of the region. They had taken perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their days followed the ancient rhythm of canonical hours. Matins before dawn, lords at sunrise, prime, tour, sex, nun, vespers, and finally compline before the great silence of night. Between prayers, they taught rudimentary letters to the daughters of planters, stitched elaborate altar cloths, tended their gardens, and maintained the kind of separation from worldly affairs that their vows demanded. They were under the supervision of Mother Superior Therese Baron, a woman of 52 whose family owned one of the largest sugar operations in the parish, and whose steely faith was renowned throughout the Dassies. The 3 slaves who served the convent had been donated by various benefactors. An elderly woman named Hella who managed the kitchen, her daughter Margaret who did the washing, and for the heavy work of the grounds, the maintenance of the buildings, the chopping of wood and clearing of drainage ditches, a young man whose name would eventually be inscribed in those 12 birth certificates. His name was Mesha's, and he had been purchased specifically for the convent in March of 1845 from an estate sale in New Iberia. He was 22 years old, of unusually light complexion, the result of generations of forced unions between enslaved women and their owners, standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the kind of quiet intelligence that made some white men nervous, and others assumed he'd make a good house servant. The convent paid $650 for him, a price that Madame Dufassad's executive considered reasonable for a healthy male in his prime. The bill of sale described him as a likely Negro man, healthy in body, sound of limb, skilled in carpentry and garden work, of docile temperament. What the bill of sale did not mention, because such things were irrelevant to property transactions, was that Mesha's could read, a dangerous skill he'd acquired secretly from the overseer's daughter on his previous plantation. It did not mention that his mother had been sold away when he was 7 years old, or that he'd seen his father beaten to death for the offense of looking a white man in the eye. It did not mention the scars on his back from a whipping he'd received at age 15 for the crime of asking permission to visit his sister on a neighboring plantation. Such details were not part of his value. His value resided in his muscles, his youth, his projected years of productive labor. The sisters, for their part, treated him with the distant benevolence that their faith prescribed for all God's creatures. They did not speak to him directly. Such intimacy would have been inappropriate, but rather issued instructions through Mother Superior TZ, who in turn conveyed them with the same crisp efficiency she used for all practical matters. He slept in a small room off the tool shed, took his meals alone, and was expected to make himself invisible unless called upon for specific tasks. He repaired the chapel roof when winter storms damaged the shingles. He maintained the drainage ditches that kept the property from flooding. He tended the vegetable gardens that fed the community. He was, in every practical sense, a ghost who performed miracles of labor without possessing the substance of a soul that might demand recognition. The arrangement worked smoothly for 8 months. Then, in November of 1845, something shifted in the careful equilibrium of the convent, though exactly when or how would later become a matter of heated dispute among those few who knew enough to dispute anything at all. The first indication that something had gone profoundly wrong came not from within the convent walls, but from the observations of Monsieur Laurent Guidry, whose plantation bordered the convent property to the east. Monsieur Guidry was a meticulous man who took his morning coffee on his gallery at precisely 6:00 every day, observing the sunrise and mentally cataloging the state of his fields, his animals, his slaves, and by extension, the general moral order of his corner of the world. In late April of 1846, he noticed that Sister Marie Thérèse, who often worked in the convent's herb garden, visible from his property line, had grown noticeably stouter. By June, 3 other sisters whom he occasionally glimpsed through the trees showed similar changes to their figures. By August, when he mentioned his observations to his wife, Deline, over supper, she hushed him immediately with a horrified expression. "You must be mistaken," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the fact that they were alone in their dining room. "Such things are not possible." "I know what I saw," Guidry insisted. 4 of them, perhaps 5, all showing the same condition." "Then they must be ill," his wife said firmly. "A swelling sickness, perhaps. The egg affects people strangely in this climate." "You will not speak of this to anyone, Laurent, to suggest such things about women who have dedicated their lives to Christ. It's not only scandalous, it's blasphemous." Guidry said nothing more to his wife, but he did mention his concerns to Father Dominique Roussel, the parish priest, during confession the following Saturday. He framed it carefully as a matter of potential illness among the sisters that might require pastoral attention. Father Roussel was 73 years old, partially deaf, and had long ago developed the convenient ability to interpret disturbing information in the most benign possible light. He assured Monsieur Guidry that the sisters were under the excellent care of Mother Superior TZ, that the climate of Louisiana was indeed difficult for women of delicate constitution, and that prayer would surely address whatever minor ailments afflicted the good sisters. What Father Roussel did not do was visit the convent to investigate. What he did not do was question Mother Superior Terra about the health of her charges. What he did not do was acknowledge even to himself the terrible possibility that had taken root in Ms. Guidry's mind. By October of 1846, the truth could no longer be contained by willful blindness or convenient interpretation. Sister Genevieve went into labor on the night of October 12th, 3 weeks earlier than the sisters had anticipated. Her cries could be heard across the gardens, high and terrified. The sound of a woman who had never expected to experience such agony and who had no framework for understanding what was happening to her body. Helen, the elderly enslaved woman who managed the kitchen, was summoned to attend the birth, having delivered countless babies in the slave quarters over her 60 years. She found Sister Genevieve in a small room on the second floor, surrounded by 5 other sisters whose own swollen bellies made it clear that this would not be an isolated incident. The baby was born just after midnight, a girl light-skinned but unmistakably of mixed race with Macia's high cheekbones and Sister Genevieve's delicate hands. 3 days later, Sister Marie Claire delivered a boy. By Christmas of 1846, 6 babies had been born within the convent walls, 4 girls and 2 boys, all healthy, all bearing the undeniable evidence of their parentage. The convent did not summon a doctor. No priest was called to perform baptisms. No birth records were filed with the parish courthouse. The babies simply appeared, were wrapped in blankets cut from old altar cloths, and were tended by sisters whose theological training had not prepared them for the practical realities of infant care. They cried through the night offices. They nursed during the hours meant for silent contemplation. They transformed the convent from a place of ordered devotion into something else entirely, a strange hybrid of monastery and nursery, where women who had renounced motherhood found themselves elbow-deep in soiled swaddling and sour milk. And through it all, Macias continued his work in the gardens, repairing fences, chopping wood, his face a careful blank that revealed nothing of what he thought or felt or understood about his role in the catastrophe unfolding around him. Mother Superior TZ understood that silence was no longer sufficient. The situation demanded action, but the nature of that action presented a theological and practical puzzle that her 52 years of unwavering faith had not prepared her to solve. She summoned Macias to her office on a January morning in 1847, the first time she had spoken to him directly in the 22 months he had lived on the property. He stood in the doorway, cap in hands, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past her left shoulder as custom demanded. "You understand the gravity of what has occurred," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "These women took vows before God, sacred vows. They renounced the world, the flesh, all earthly attachments. What has happened here is not merely sin. It is sacrilege of the highest order." Macias said nothing. What could he say? That he had not initiated what had happened. That he had been as much property in these encounters as he was in every other aspect of his existence. That consent was not a word that applied to a man who could be sold or killed at the whim of those who owned him. None of these truths would make any difference to the woman sitting across from him, her face pale and drawn with the weight of a scandal that threatened everything she had built. 6 children have been born, she continued. 6 more are expected before summer. The church cannot know of this. The Dassies cannot know of this. If word reaches New Orleans, if the Archbishop learns what has transpired here, this convent will be closed. The sisters will be defrocked and cast out in disgrace, and the church itself will suffer a blow to its moral authority that could take generations to repair. She paused, studying him with eyes that held no warmth, but also strangely no hatred. "You cannot remain here," she said finally. "Your presence is a constant reminder of our shame. But neither can you be sold, because whoever purchases you might eventually learn why you were sold, and questions would be asked that we cannot afford to answer. Do you understand the position you occupy? You are simultaneously the instrument of our ruin and the only witness whose testimony must never be heard." The solution Mother Superior Terras devised was as pragmatic as it was cruel. Macias would remain on the property, but he would be moved to the far edge of the grounds, to a small cabin that had once housed the previous groundskeeper, located so deep in the cypress grove that even the sound of the chapel bells barely reached it. He would continue his work maintaining the property, but he would do so at night, or in the early morning hours before the sisters emerged for Lourdes, or during the afternoon rest period when the galleries were empty. Would become even more of a ghost than he had been before, a phantom whose labor sustained the community, but whose face must never again be seen by those whose lives he had irrevocably altered. The babies, meanwhile, presented their own complex problem. They could not remain at the convent indefinitely. Children required explanations, and as they grew, they would require education, social position, legal status. Yet they could not simply be disposed of as one might dispose of an inconvenient object. They were, whatever their origins, baptized souls, and Catholic doctrine was clear about the sanctity of life. even lives that originated in circumstances the church found abhorrent. Over the next 18 months, as the remaining 6 sisters delivered their children, Mother Superior TZ quietly arranged for each baby to be placed with families in distant parishes. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Mobile, even as far as Natchez. The families who received these children were told various stories, that they were orphans from a convent in France, that their mothers had died in childbirth, that they were the illegitimate offspring of wealthy planters seeking to protect their reputations. Money changed hands. Donations to ensure the children would be raised in good Catholic homes, educated properly, perhaps even allowed to pass into white society if their complexions permitted such a deception. By August of 1848, all 12 children had been born and quietly removed from the convent. The last was a boy born to Sister Angelique on the feast day of the Assumption, August 15th. He was placed with a family in Natchez, who believed him to be the orphaned son of a French planter and his quadroon mistress. The convent returned superficially to its former routine. The sisters rose for matins. They prayed the offices. They taught the daughters of planters their letters and their catechism. They maintained the fiction that nothing extraordinary had occurred within their walls, but something fundamental had broken in the careful mechanism of their communal life. The vow of silence, which had once been a spiritual discipline, became a psychological burden almost too heavy to bear. They could not speak of what had happened. Not to each other, not in confession, not even in the privacy of their own prayers. The weight of that unspeakable secret pressed down on them like the humid air before a storm growing heavier with each passing season. Sister Genevieve, who had been the first to deliver, began to suffer from headaches that kept her in bed for days at a time. Sister Marie Claire stopped eating and grew so thin that Mother Superior had to force broth down her throat to keep her alive. Msure Guidry was a meticulous man who took his morning coffee on his gallery at precisely 6:00 every day, observing the sunrise and mentally cataloging the state of his fields, his animals, his slaves, and by extension, the general moral order of his corner of the world. In late April of 1846, he noticed that Sister Marie Thérèse, who often worked in the convent's herb garden, visible from his property line, had grown noticeably stouter. By June, 3 other sisters whom he occasionally glimpsed through the trees showed similar changes to their figures. By August, when he mentioned his observations to his wife, Deline, over supper, she hushed him immediately with a horrified expression. "You must be mistaken," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the fact that they were alone in their dining room. "Such things are not possible." "I know what I saw," Guidry insisted. 4 of them, perhaps 5, all showing the same condition." "Then they must be ill," his wife said firmly. "A swelling sickness, perhaps. The egg affects people strangely in this climate." "You will not speak of this to anyone, Lauron. To suggest such things about women who have dedicated their lives to Christ. It's not only scandalous, it's blasphemous." Guidry said nothing more to his wife, but he did mention his concerns to Father Dominique Roussel, the parish priest, during confession the following Saturday. He framed it carefully as a matter of potential illness among the sisters that might require pastoral attention. Father Roussel was 73 years old, partially deaf, and had long ago developed the convenient ability to interpret disturbing information in the most benign possible light. He assured Msure Guidry that the sisters were under the excellent care of Mother Superior TZ, that the climate of Louisiana was indeed difficult for women of delicate constitution, and that prayer would surely address whatever minor ailments afflicted the good sisters. What Father Roussel did not do was visit the convent to investigate. What he did not do was question Mother Superior Terra about the health of her charges. What he did not do was acknowledge even to himself the terrible possibility that had taken root in Ms. Guidry's mind. By October of 1846, the truth could no longer be contained by willful blindness or convenient interpretation. Sister Genevieve went into labor on the night of October 12th, 3 weeks earlier than the sisters had anticipated. Her cries could be heard across the gardens, high and terrified. The sound of a woman who had never expected to experience such agony and who had no framework for understanding what was happening to her body. Helen, the elderly enslaved woman who managed the kitchen, was summoned to attend the birth, having delivered countless babies in the slave quarters over her 60 years. She found Sister Genevieve in a small room on the 2nd floor, surrounded by 5 other sisters whose own swollen bellies made it clear that this would not be an isolated incident. The baby was born just after midnight, a girl, light-skinned but unmistakably of mixed race with Macia's high cheekbones and Sister Genevieve's delicate hands. 3 days later, Sister Marie Claire delivered a boy. By Christmas of 1846, 6 babies had been born within the convent walls. 4 girls and 2 boys, all healthy, all bearing the undeniable evidence of their parentage. The convent did not summon a doctor. No priest was called to perform baptisms. No birth records were filed with the parish courthouse. The babies simply appeared, were wrapped in blankets cut from old altar cloths, and were tended by sisters whose theological training had not prepared them for the practical realities of infant care. They cried through the night offices. They nursed during the hours meant for silent contemplation. They transformed the convent from a place of ordered devotion into something else entirely, a strange hybrid of monastery and nursery, where women who had renounced motherhood found themselves elbow-deep in soiled swaddling and sour milk. And through it all, Macias continued his work in the gardens, repairing fences, chopping wood, his face a careful blank that revealed nothing of what he thought or felt or understood about his role in the catastrophe unfolding around him. Mother Superior TZ understood that silence was no longer sufficient. The situation demanded action, but the nature of that action presented a theological and practical puzzle that her 52 years of unwavering faith had not prepared her to solve. She summoned Macias to her office on a January morning in 1847, the first time she had spoken to him directly in the 22 months he had lived on the property. He stood in the doorway, cap in hands, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past her left shoulder as custom demanded. "You understand the gravity of what has occurred," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "These women took vows before God, sacred vows. They renounced the world, the flesh, all earthly attachments. What has happened here is not merely sin. It is sacrilege of the highest order." Macias said nothing. What could he say? That he had not initiated what had happened. That he had been as much property in these encounters as he was in every other aspect of his existence. That consent was not a word that applied to a man who could be sold or killed at the whim of those who owned him. None of these truths would make any difference to the woman sitting across from him, her face pale and drawn with the weight of a scandal that threatened everything she had built. 6 children have been born, she continued. 6 more are expected before summer. The church cannot know of this. The Dassies cannot know of this. If word reaches New Orleans, if the Archbishop learns what has transpired here, this convent will be closed. The sisters will be defrocked and cast out in disgrace, and the church itself will suffer a blow to its moral authority that could take generations to repair. She paused, studying him with eyes that held no warmth, but also strangely no hatred. "You cannot remain here," she said finally. "Your presence is a constant reminder of our shame, but neither can you be sold because whoever purchases you might eventually learn why you were sold, and questions would be asked that we cannot afford to answer. Do you understand the position you occupy? You are simultaneously the instrument of our ruin and the only witness whose testimony must never be heard." The solution Mother Superior Terras devised was as pragmatic as it was cruel. Macias would remain on the property, but he would be moved to the far edge of the grounds, to a small cabin that had once housed the previous groundskeeper, located so deep in the cypress grove that even the sound of the chapel bells barely reached it. He would continue his work maintaining the property, but he would do so at night, or in the early morning hours before the sisters emerged for Lourdes, or during the afternoon rest period when the galleries were empty. Would become even more of a ghost than he had been before, a phantom whose labor sustained the community, but whose face must never again be seen by those whose lives he had irrevocably altered. The babies, meanwhile, presented their own complex problem. They could not remain at the convent indefinitely. Children required explanations, and as they grew, they would require education, social position, legal status. Yet they could not simply be disposed of as one might dispose of an inconvenient object. They were, whatever their origins, baptized souls, and Catholic doctrine was clear about the sanctity of life, even lives that originated in circumstances the Church found abhorrent. Over the next 18 months, as the remaining 6 sisters delivered their children, Mother Superior TZ quietly arranged for each baby to be placed with families in distant parishes. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Mobile, even as far as Natchez. The families who received these children were told various stories, that they were orphans from a convent in France, that their mothers had died in childbirth, that they were the illegitimate offspring of wealthy planters seeking to protect their reputations. Money changed hands. Donations to ensure the children would be raised in good Catholic homes, educated properly, perhaps even allowed to pass into white society if their complexions permitted such a deception. By August of 1848, all 12 children had been born and quietly removed from the convent. The last was a boy born to Sister Angelique on the feast day of the Assumption, August 15th. He was placed with a family in Natchez, who believed him to be the orphaned son of a French planter and his quadroon mistress. The convent returned superficially to its former routine. The sisters rose for matins. They prayed the offices. They taught the daughters of planters their letters and their catechism. They maintained the fiction that nothing extraordinary had occurred within their walls, but something fundamental had broken in the careful mechanism of their communal life. The vow of silence, which had once been a spiritual discipline, became a psychological burden almost too heavy to bear. They could not speak of what had happened, not to each other, not in confession, not even in the privacy of their own prayers. The weight of that unspeakable secret pressed down on them like the humid air before a storm, growing heavier with each passing season. Sister Genevieve, who had been the first to deliver, began to suffer from headaches that kept her in bed for days at a time. Sister Marie Claire stopped eating and grew so thin that Mother Superior had to force broth down her throat to keep her alive. Sister Therese Meline, the youngest at 23, began to scratch at her arms until they bled, leaving scars that she tried to hide beneath her long sleeves. And Macias, in his cabin at the edge of the property, lived in an isolation so complete that he sometimes went days without speaking a single word aloud. He chopped wood. He cleared brush. He repaired fences in the dead of night. And he wondered in the small hours when sleep would not come whether God had cursed him or saved him, and whether there was any meaningful difference between the two. The letter that would eventually reach the Vatican was written not by Mother Superior Therese, but by Sister Jean Baptiste, who had been the last to conceive and the most tormented by what she had participated in. She was 31 years old, the daughter of a notary from Lafayette, and before taking her vows, she had been considered the most intellectual of her family, a woman who read Latin poetry and kept detailed journals of her spiritual development. In the spring of 1850, 2 years after the birth of the last child, Sister Jean Baptiste began to write an account of what had transpired at Sacred Mercy. She wrote it in her cell late at night by the light of a single candle. She wrote it not in French, which would have been her natural language, but in Latin, the universal language of the Church, because she intended it not for local authorities, but for Rome itself. Her account was remarkable for its precision and its unflinching honesty. She did not excuse what had happened. She did not blame Macias, whom she described as an instrument of providence or perhaps of our own collective madness. She did not claim supernatural causes or diabolic possession, those convenient explanations that might have shifted responsibility away from the human actors involved. Instead, she traced with almost scientific detachment the psychological and spiritual deterioration that had led 12 women who had vowed perpetual chastity to systematically violate those vows with the same man over a period of nearly 3 years. It had begun, she wrote, with Sister Marie Tz, who had been the first to break. Sister Marie Tz was 28, from a prominent family in St. Martinville, and had taken her vows at 18 after a broken engagement had left her convinced that earthly love was fundamentally unreliable. She had been assigned to oversee the kitchen gardens, which meant she worked in proximity to Macias throughout the spring and summer of 1845, directing his labor while maintaining the appropriate distance their relative positions demanded. But something had happened during those long afternoons in the garden, something that Sister Jean Baptiste struggled to articulate in her Latin prose. Sister Maritz had begun to see Macias not as property, but as a person, a man who laughed quietly at private jokes, who spoke to the plants as he tended them, who once caught a small bird that had become tangled in the bean netting and freed it with hands so gentle that the creature flew away uninjured. Small acts of unexpected kindness that revealed an interior life, a personhood that should have been irrelevant, but somehow in the close quarters of the garden became impossible to ignore. The actual seduction, if that word could even be applied to an encounter between an enslaved man and a woman who held absolute power over his existence, had occurred in the tool shed on an August afternoon, when the heat had driven everyone else indoors for the siesta. Sister Marie Tz had sought him out to ask about the tomato blight that was destroying the crop. What transpired between them was described by Sister Jean Baptiste in the most clinical possible terms. But the essential fact was clear. Sister Maritz had initiated physical contact with Macias, and he, understanding that resistance was both practically impossible and potentially fatal, had complied. What happened next was not diabolic possession or mass hysteria, though both explanations would later be suggested by those seeking to understand the incomprehensible. What happened was more subtle and more damning. Sister Marie TZ had confessed to Sister Angelique, seeking comfort or absolution, or perhaps simply someone to share the enormous weight of what she had done. But confession between sisters was not the same as confession to a priest. There was no formal absolution, no penance assigned, no mechanism for processing the enormity of the sin. Instead, there was only the shocking intimacy of shared transgression. Sister Angelique, hearing the details of what Sister Maritz had experienced, found herself consumed by a curiosity she could not name and could not resist. Within a month, Sister Angelique had also sought out Macias. The pattern, once established, replicated itself with the inexorable logic of a plague spreading through a closed population. Sister confessed to sister, seeking understanding from those who shared their vows and their isolation. But rather than creating a bulwark against further transgression, each confession seemed to normalize what had happened, to make it seem less impossible, less unthinkable. By the winter of 1845, 8 of the 12 sisters had broken their vows of chastity with the same man, and by spring, all 12 had followed. Sister Jean Baptiste's account struggled to explain the collective psychology that had made this possible. How could 12 women, all from respectable families, all educated in the faith, all bound by sacred vows, have participated in something so fundamentally at odds with everything they professed to believe? She examined various explanations in her letter. The isolation of the convent from normal society, the fact that Mattis was enslaved, and therefore existed in a legal and moral category that somehow seemed separate from normal prohibitions, the fact that he could not refuse them or expose them without risking his own life, the strange intimacy that develops in any closed religious community, the way transgression by one member made transgressing on by others seem less impossible. But ultimately, she confessed, she could not fully explain it, even to herself. She could only document what had happened and leave it to wiser minds to determine what, if anything, it meant. The letter concluded with a plea that the church intervene, that the scandal be investigated, that the sisters be given proper penance and the opportunity for genuine repentance. She sealed it carefully, addressed it to the Vatican Sacred Congregation for Religious, and entrusted it to a visiting priest from New Orleans who promised to ensure its safe delivery to Rome. What Sister Jean Baptiste did not know was that the visiting priest, Father Olmo Hebert, never sent the letter to Rome. Instead, after reading it in the privacy of his quarters in New Orleans, he summoned the Archbishop, and the Archbishop summoned Mother Superior Terra, and the matter was handled not by the Vatican, but by the diocese itself, in the manner that such matters had been handled for centuries. Through silence, through burial, through the systematic erasure of evidence that anything untoward had ever occurred. The Archbishop of New Orleans, Henry Marie Laurent, was 68 years old and had navigated countless scandals during his 3 decades of service to the church in Louisiana. He had managed the fallout from priests who kept concubines, from financial irregularities in parish accounts, from the constant tension between French and American Catholics who viewed each other with mutual suspicion. But this was unprecedented in both its scope and its potential for devastating the church's moral authority in a region where Protestant critics were always eager to find evidence of Catholic corruption. He arrived at Sacred Mercy on October 20th, 1850, in a private carriage accompanied only by Father Haber and a Jesuit priest named Father Michel Dufresne, who had been brought in specifically for his skill in canonical law and his reputation for discretion. They met with Mother Superior Terre and the 12 sisters in the convent's chapter house, a sparse room with whitewashed walls and narrow windows that looked out over the gardens where so much of what had transpired had begun. The Archbishop did not sit. He stood at the head of the long wooden table, his hands clasped behind his back, his face revealing nothing of what he felt or thought. He was a political man, a man who understood power and its careful manipulation. And he approached this crisis not as a spiritual problem, but as a problem of containment and control. "What Sister Jean Baptiste has written is true?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone determined not to betray emotion. "It is true," Mother Superior TZ said. She looked older than her 54 years, her face deeply lined, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "All 12 of you participated in this situation." "All 12, Mother Superior Terres confirmed. "And the man in question, this slave Macias, he still resides on the property." "He does." The archbishop was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at something none of the others could see. Where are the children? Mother Superior Turs provided a list which Father Dufine carefully recorded in a leather-bound notebook. 12 names, 12 locations, 12 families who believed they had received orphans or illegitimate children in need of Christian homes. They will need to be monitored, the archbishop said, discreetly, to ensure that as they grow, no questions are asked that might lead back to this place. Father Dufin, you will handle that personally. Of course, Your Grace, the Jesuit said quietly. The archbishop turned his attention to the sisters themselves, studying each face in turn. What he saw there was not defiance or impenitence, but rather a kind of hollow exhaustion, the look of people who had been carrying an impossible weight for so long that they no longer remembered what it felt like to stand upright. You understand that what you have done is not merely a violation of your vows, he said. It is a scandal that if it became public would be used by enemies of the Church to argue that Catholic religious life is fundamentally corrupt. That vows mean nothing. That the spiritual authority of the Church is a sham. Your actions have placed in jeopardy not only your own souls, but the faith of countless believers who trust that consecrated religious are different from ordinary sinners. Do you comprehend the magnitude of this? Several of the sisters began to weep. Sister Jean-Baptiste kept her eyes fixed on the table, her face pale but composed. What would you have us do? Sister Maritz asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The archbishop drew a long breath. You will leave this place tonight. You will be dispersed to different convents across the region, one sister per community, never two together. You will take new names. You will never again speak of what happened here, not to each other, not in confession, not even on your deathbeds. You will consider yourselves under a perpetual seal of secrecy, violation of which will result in immediate excommunication and eternal damnation. You will spend the remainder of your lives in prayer and penance, but you will do so in silence, and you will do so apart from one another. And what of Macias? Mother Superior TZ asked. The archbishop's face hardened. The man presents a unique problem. He cannot be freed because free people ask questions and tell stories. He cannot be sold for the same reason. His continued existence is a threat to everything we seek to protect. The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Your Grace, Father here said carefully, the Church cannot be seen to countenance murder. The Church countenance is nothing, the archbishop said coldly. The Church knows nothing of what has transpired here. Sacred Mercy will close due to financial difficulties. The property will be sold, and in the confusion of that closure, a slave who had been working the grounds will unfortunately disappear. Such things happen in Louisiana. Slaves run away, or they meet with accidents, or they are sold quietly to distant territories. No one will investigate too closely. No one will care particularly, provided the official story is plausible. Sister Jean-Baptiste stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You cannot mean to have him killed. He is innocent in all of this, more innocent than we are. We held all the power. We initiated everything that happened. He had no choice in any of it. The archbishop regarded her with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. Sister, you display a touching concern for the soul of a man you have grievously wronged, but I am afraid your opinion on this matter is not being solicited. The decision has been made. Father Dufin will ensure that it is carried out with mercy and dispatch. I will not allow it, Sister Jean-Baptiste said, her voice rising. I wrote my letter precisely to prevent such an injustice. If you proceed with this plan, I will write to Rome again. I will expose everything. You will do nothing, the archbishop said, and for the first time, genuine anger crept into his voice. Because if you expose this scandal, you will destroy not only yourself and these sisters, but the faith of thousands of Catholics who depend on the Church for their spiritual sustenance. You will hand Protestant critics the weapon they have been seeking for decades to argue that Catholicism is fundamentally corrupt. You will undermine the missionary work that is bringing the gospel to the frontier. You will sacrifice countless souls for the sake of one man's life. A man who is legally, and in the eyes of most of the world, not even a person but property. Is that really the trade you wish to make? Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the moral complexity at Sacred Mercy deepens beyond anything simple judgment can contain. If this story is giving you chills, if you're recognizing the impossible position every single person found themselves in, share this video with someone who understands that history's darkest moments resist easy explanations. Hit that like button to support content that refuses to look away from uncomfortable truths. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together how this impossible situation resolved itself. What happened next was recorded in several conflicting accounts, and the truth of it remains contested even among the few who knew enough to contest anything. The official record states that the Convent of the Sacred Mercy closed its doors on November 3, 1850, due to financial difficulties and the declining health of several sisters. The property was purchased by a planter from Assumption Parish who converted the buildings into a sugar mill. The sisters were dispersed to various religious communities throughout the region. The slaves who had served the convent, Helen, Margot, and Macias, were sold as part of the estate liquidation. This is what appeared in the diocese and records, in the legal documents filed with the parish courthouse, in the brief notice that ran in the New Orleans Catholic press. But there exists another account, one that survived only through the private journals of those directly involved, and through oral testimonies passed down within families who had reason to remember. According to these sources, the truth was far more complex and far more dangerous than the official version suggested. On the night of October 31st, 1850, 3 days after the Archbishop's visit, Sister Jean Baptiste left the convent grounds after complaint and made her way through the cypress grove to the cabin where Macias lived in isolation. She found him sitting on the narrow porch, working by moonlight on a piece of carpentry, carving designs into a panel of cypress wood with tools that looked ancient in his hands. "They mean to kill you," she said without preamble. Macias set down his knife carefully, though his hands did not shake. "I know," he said quietly. "You know. I've known since the Archbishop arrived, maybe before. Men like him don't leave loose ends. I'm the loosest end there could be." Sister Jean Baptiste sank onto the porch steps, her habit pooling around her in the darkness. For a long moment, neither spoke. Somewhere in the swamp, an alligator bellowed, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing during her years at Sacred Mercy. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "for all of it, for what we did to you, for not having the courage to refuse what the others had already done, for not stopping it before it started, for writing that letter thinking it would bring justice when all it's brought is this." "You got nothing to be sorry for," Macias said quietly. "Not to me anyway. You thought you were doing right. I was a coward. We all were. We let ourselves. We told ourselves stories about how it wasn't really sin because you weren't really. Because your status made it somehow different. We created justifications that let us violate everything we claim to believe, and now you'll pay the price for our weakness." Macias picked up his knife again, turning it in his hands, watching how the moonlight caught the blade. "You going to run?" Sister Jean Baptiste asked. "Where would I run to? I'm a light-skinned black man in Louisiana who can read and write. I'd be stopped at the first checkpoint, questioned, examined. Without papers, without an owner to vouch for me, I'd be sold at auction or worse within a week. Running isn't freedom for someone like me. It's just a slower form of dying." "Then what will you do?" "The same thing I've been doing. Chop the wood they tell me to chop, fix what they tell me to fix, wait for whatever's coming." Sister Jean Baptiste stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I won't let them do this." "You don't have a choice," Macias said, not unkindly. "They got all the power, sister. They always did. You're just now seeing it clearly." But Sister Jean Baptiste had spent the previous 3 nights preparing for this moment, working by candle light in her cell while the other sisters slept. What she did next would be whispered about for decades among those few who knew the full story, though the details would blur and change with each telling. On the morning of November 1st, All Saints' Day, she requested a private audience with Mother Superior Tares. When it was granted, she presented a document she had prepared during those sleepless nights. A full written confession, signed and dated, detailing everything that had transpired at Sacred Mercy. The document ran to 17 pages of dense script. It included the names of all participants, the dates she could remember, the circumstances that had led to the first transgression, and those that had perpetuated it. It described with clinical precision how Sister Marie Thier had been the first, how the pattern had spread through confession and shared guilt, how each sister had rationalized what was happening through theological contortions that now seemed grotesque in retrospect. But most significantly, the document detailed the disposition of the 12 children, their current locations, the families who had received them, the amounts of money that had changed hands, and the false stories those families had been told. It named specific priests who had facilitated the placement. It referenced specific bank transactions from the convent's accounts. It provided, in essence, a complete roadmap that any investigator could follow to verify every element of the scandal. Sister Jean Baptiste had made 4 copies of this document, each one painstakingly reproduced in her careful hand over those 3 nights. She kept one herself, hidden in the lining of her prayer book. The second she entrusted to Hen, the enslaved woman who had delivered all 12 babies, with explicit instructions written in French. Though Hen could not read, she understood the gravity of what she held and knew to protect it. The third copy she had already mailed, 3 days prior, to a cousin in Mobile who was married to a journalist with connections to abolitionist newspapers in the North. The fourth copy she handed to Mother Superior TZ. "Insurance," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that made her hands tremble. "If anything happens to Meishes, if he disappears, if he meets with an accident, if he is sold to some distant territory where no one will ever hear from him again, these documents will become public. My cousin in Mobile has instructions to forward his copy to northern newspapers." The story would spread across every Protestant publication in the country within a month. The church would face not merely local embarrassment, but a national crisis. Mother Superior TZ stared at the document in her hands as if it were a serpent. Her face had gone the color of old parchment. "You would destroy the church to save one man. I would refuse to let the church become complicit in murder," Sister Jean Baptiste said. "There's a difference. We have already violated our vows, already brought scandal upon this community. But if we add murder to our sins, if we allow an innocent man to be killed simply because his continued existence inconveniences us, then we become something far worse than hypocrites. We become murderers, and I will not carry that sin to my grave." "The Archbishop will never accept this," Mother Superior TZ said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "Then let him explain to the Catholic faithful how 12 consecrated religious became pregnant by the same enslaved man, and why the Church's solution was to eliminate the only truly innocent party in the entire affair," Sister Jean Baptiste said. "Let him stand before the public and defend that decision." What transpired over the next 5 days was conducted in the strictest secrecy behind closed doors, with only the principal actors aware of the true stakes. Mother Superior TZ brought Sister Jean Baptiste's ultimatum to the Archbishop. The meeting, according to fragments of testimony later given by Father Hare, was explosive. The Archbishop threatened excommunication, threatened to have Sister Jean Baptiste committed to an asylum, threatened to use his considerable influence to ensure her family's ruin throughout Louisiana. But underneath the rage was a cold calculation that recognized the weakness of his position. Protestant newspapers in the North were eager for any scandal that might damage Catholic credibility. The abolition movement was gaining strength, and a story about an enslaved man and 12 white nuns would provide perfect ammunition. And if it emerged that the church had murdered a man to cover up the scandal, the damage would be catastrophic. Father Hare and Father Dufine, the Jesuit who had accompanied the Archbishop to Sacred Mercy, both counseletted caution. At least the original transgression could be framed as human weakness, they argued, but premeditated murder to protect the Church's reputation would be indefensible before God and man. The Archbishop consulted with his advisors through the first days of November. The mathematics of power and scandal were weighed with the same careful attention that might be given to a complicated business transaction. Finally, on November 5th, a compromise was reached. Sister Jean Baptiste was summoned to meet with the Archbishop in the convent's chapter house. He did not sit. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face revealing nothing. "You have placed the church in an impossible position," he said coldly. "You have used threats and blackmail to force our hand. These are not the actions of a woman consecrated to God." "No," Sister Jean Baptiste agreed quietly. "They are the actions of a woman who has already violated her vows so completely that one more sin in service of justice seems a small price to pay." The Archbishop's jaw tightened, but he continued, "Nevertheless, we find ourselves constrained by your arrangements. The man Meishes will be manumitted. He will receive papers of freedom, money, and letters of introduction to Catholic communities in the North. He will be allowed to leave Louisiana unmolested. In exchange, you will surrender 3 of the 4 copies of your confession. The 4th may remain with your cousin in Mobile, but only as insurance against any future action on our part. If Meishes arrives safely in the North and remains unmolested, that copy is to be destroyed. Do you accept these terms?" I accept them, Sister Jean-Baptiste said, with one additional condition. The Archbishop's eyes narrowed dangerously. You are in no position to make demands. I want to speak with Macias before he leaves to explain what has been arranged and to receive his consent. Without that, I cannot be certain he is leaving freely rather than being coerced. A long silence followed. Finally, the Archbishop nodded curtly. You may speak with him once in the chapel with Father Dufine present as witness. But understand this, sister, you and the others will be dispersed immediately after Macias's departure. You will be sent to different convents, separated permanently. You will never speak of this matter again, not to each other, not in confession, not on your deathbeds. You will live the remainder of your lives in penance and silence. This is not negotiable. I understand, Sister Jean-Baptiste said. The meeting took place on the evening of November 7th in the convent's chapel. The space was lit only by the eternal flame before the tabernacle and a few candles that cast long shadows across the empty pews. Macias entered wearing new clothes, a simple but decent suit of brown wool, a white shirt, a black vest. He looked uncomfortable in the formal attire, his hands uncertain where to rest. Sister Jean-Baptiste approached him, stopping at a distance that convention required. For a long moment, neither spoke. They're letting you go, she said. Finally, you'll have papers, real papers, signed by the Archbishop, money enough to start over, letters that will help you find work in Ohio or wherever you choose to settle. Mia studied her face, searching for deception. Why? Because it's the only just outcome, because you were blameless in all of this, because allowing you to be killed to protect our secrets would compound one sin with another far worse. And the Church agreed to this out of justice. His tone carried no accusation, only weary skepticism. The Church agreed because I made it the least damaging option available to them, Sister Jean-Baptiste said. I threatened to expose everything if they harmed you. They calculated that freeing you was preferable to the scandal. Macias was quiet for a moment. So I'm free because of blackmail. You're free because sometimes the only way to force powerful people to do the right thing is to make it in their interest, Sister Jean-Baptiste said. I'm not proud of the method, but I'm not ashamed of the result. What happens to you? I'll be sent away to some isolated convent where I can't cause further trouble. I'll spend the rest of my life in penance, but I'll be alive and I'll be able to live with my conscience. Macias nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something, a small carved figure no more than 3 in. Tall, shaped from cypress wood. It depicted a woman in a habit kneeling in prayer, rendered with extraordinary skill. I made this, he said, offering it to her. Before I knew what they were planning, I was going to leave it in the chapel as a gift, anonymous, like figured I'd never get to give it proper. Sister Jean-Baptiste took the carving, her fingers closing around it gently. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Every fold of the habit captured perfectly, the hands positioned in a gesture that conveyed both humility and strength. I can't accept this, she said softly. After everything we put you through, I have no right to a gift from your hands. It ain't about right, Macias said. It's about remembering that not everything that happened here was evil. There were moments, small moments, when I felt like maybe there was something good trying to exist in all this mess. Those things were real too, and I need to believe they mattered even though everything around them was broken. Sister Jean-Baptiste's eyes filled with tears. You're more generous than any of us deserve. I'm tired, sister, tired of carrying hatred. If I take all that north with me, they'll have taken more than my years here. They'll have taken my future too. So I'm choosing to remember that you fought for me when you didn't have to, that you risked everything to save someone most people think ain't worth saving. That matters. That's what I'm taking with me. They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then Macias nodded once, turned, and walked out of the chapel, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor until they faded into the night. Sister Jean-Baptiste remained in the pew, the carved figure clasped in her hands until Father Dufine gently touched her shoulder and told her it was time to return to her cell. On November 8, 1850, Macias walked down the Shell Road from Sacred Mercy for the last time. He carried a canvas bag containing his new clothes, his freedom papers carefully wrapped in oilcloth, $50 in coin, a substantial sum for a newly freed man, and letters of introduction to Catholic communities in Cincinnati and Cleveland. The Archbishop's secretary had provided an additional letter on official church stationery describing Macias as a man of good character and sound work ethic who seeks to begin a new life in freedom. Several people witnessed his departure. Ms. Guidry, taking his morning coffee on his gallery, watched the tall figure walking toward town and noted it in his journal with the brief observation. The colored man from Sacred Mercy departed this morning, carrying what appeared to be traveling effects. He looked neither back nor around him, but walked with the steady purpose of a man who knows his destination. At the St. Martinville landing, Meisha's purchased passage on the steamboat Teshbel, bound for New Orleans. The boat's manifest listed him as Meisha's Duval, free man of color, destination Cincinnati. The surname was New, his choice, taken perhaps from the name of the street where the convent stood, or from some private meaning known only to him. The Teshbel departed at 3:00 in the afternoon, its paddle wheel churning the brown water of the bayou as it made its way toward the Mississippi, and then north toward a future that Meisha's could barely imagine but was determined to claim. He was never seen in Louisiana again. The 12 Sisters of Sacred Mercy were dispersed within the week, exactly as the Archbishop had decreed. Each was sent to a different convent scattered across the South and as far north as Maryland, with explicit instructions that they were never to communicate with one another or speak of their years at Sacred Mercy. Mother Superior Therese Baron was sent to a Carmelite monastery in Kentucky, where the rule of strict enclosure meant she would spend the remainder of her days behind walls that no woman could cross once she entered. She died there in the winter of 1868, having maintained absolute silence about Sacred Mercy for 18 years. The only record of her final words comes from the sister who attended her deathbed, who reported that Mother Therese whispered, "Forgive us," 3 times before her breath ceased, though to whom or for what she sought forgiveness was left unspoken. Sister Maritz, who had been the first to break her vows, was sent to a teaching convent in Baltimore. She spent 23 years instructing the daughters of Irish and German immigrants in reading, writing, and catechism. According to letters preserved in the convent's archives, she was regarded as an excellent teacher, but unusually withdrawn, never volunteering information about her past, and changing the subject whenever her previous posting was mentioned. She died of consumption in 1873 at the age of 56, and was buried in the convent cemetery under a simple stone that bore only her religious name and the dates of her birth and death. Sister Ainlick, the youngest and the mother of the last child born at Sacred Mercy, was sent to a mission convent in Arkansas that served Creek Indians and scattered white settlers. The conditions there were harsh. The sisters lived in rough cabins, subsisted on cornmeal and salt pork, and faced constant threats from both disease and occasional violence. Sister Angelique lasted 7 years before contracting malaria that weakened her to the point where she could no longer perform her duties. She was transferred to a larger convent in Little Rock, where she died in 1859, aged 32. Her final letter to the Mother Superior in Little Rock contained a single cryptic line: "I have paid what I owed and I'm ready to face my judge." Sister Jean Baptiste was sent to the most remote posting the Archbishop could arrange, a mission station in the Alabama wilderness, 40 mi from the nearest town, where 2 elderly nuns ministered to scattered populations of farmers and the remnants of displaced Indian tribes. She arrived there in November of 1850 and would remain for the next 34 years until her death in 1884. The conditions at the Alabama mission were brutal by any measure. The sisters lived in a log structure with gaps in the walls that let in wind and rain. They grew their own food, hauled their own water, made their own candles and soap. Sister Jean Baptiste, who had grown up in comfort as the daughter of a prosperous notary, learned to split wood, to plant and harvest corn, to treat wounds and illness with herbs she gathered from the forest. But she also wrote. Despite the isolation, despite the physical hardship, she maintained detailed journals throughout her years in Alabama. She wrote in French, in Latin, occasionally in English when writing to local authorities about supplies or assistance. She translated religious texts into Greek, working with native speakers to ensure accuracy. And most significantly, she wrote a detailed account of what had transpired at Sacred Mercy, not as confession or justification, but as simple testimony to events that she believed should not be allowed to disappear into convenient silence. This manuscript remained in her possession until her death. What became of it afterward is unclear. The elderly nun who attended Sister Jean Baptiste's final hours reported that the manuscript was wrapped in oilcloth and given to a traveling priest with instructions that it be delivered to someone who would understand its importance. Whether those instructions were followed, whether the manuscript survived, whether it found its intended recipient, all of this remains unknown. Sister Jean Baptiste died on a cold morning in February 1884 at the age of 65. According to the brief death notice sent to the Dassies, her final words were, "I did what I could. God will judge whether it was enough." The 12 children born from the impossible unions at Sacred Mercy lived and grew, scattered across the South, each carrying within their bodies the evidence of a scandal that had been carefully buried. Their fates varied as widely as the circumstances of their placement and the color of their skin. The child born to Sister Genevieve in October 1846, the first baby, a girl, was placed with a wealthy Creole family in New Orleans. She was raised as their own, educated by private tutors, married at 17 to the son of another prominent family. She bore 5 children and died in 1901, never knowing that her mother had been a nun or that her father had been enslaved. Her descendants carried forward her light eyes and high cheekbones, genetic markers that appeared unexpectedly in subsequent generations without explanation. The child born to Sister Marie Claire, a boy with darker skin that made passing into white society impossible, was placed with a free black family in Baton Rouge, who ran a cooperative business. He learned the trade, worked with his hands, married a free woman of color when he was 23. During Reconstruction, he briefly participated in local politics, serving on a parish committee before the imposition of Jim Crow laws made such participation impossible. He died in 1898, having lived to see most of the gains of Reconstruction reversed. But he died free, surrounded by children and grandchildren who bore his name. The child born to Sister Angelique, the last baby delivered on the Feast of the Assumption, was placed with a family in Natchez. This family moved west to Texas in 1855, seeking opportunities in the newly opened territories. The boy grew up in San Antonio, worked as a ranch hand, learned to break horses and mend fences. He fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side, conscripted like so many men of ambiguous racial status who were light enough to pass, but vulnerable enough to be forced into service. He survived the war, returned to Texas, and disappeared into the anonymity of the West. Some records suggest he may have ended up in California, but the trail grows cold in the 1870s. 3 of the 12 children died young, 2 from yellow fever during the epidemic of 1853, 1 from scarlet fever in 1854. Their graves were marked with simple stones that told no lies but revealed no truths either, recording only names, dates, and the universal inscription, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." The remaining 6 children lived into adulthood, married, had children of their own. Some grew up believing they were orphans. Others thought they were the illegitimate offspring of planters and their enslaved or frequeled mistresses, a common enough story in Louisiana that it aroused little comment or curiosity. None knew the full truth of their origins, and by the time they were old enough to ask complicated questions, the people who might have answered were dead or dispersed or bound by vows of silence that not even deathbed confession could break. But the genetic inheritance persisted. Light eyes in families whose eyes had always been dark, unusually straight hair appearing in kinkered curls, height that seemed to come from nowhere. These markers passed down through generations, inexplicable quirks that families noted and then forgot, having no framework for understanding their significance. The fate of Macias himself became a matter of speculation and scattered evidence. The Freedom Papers issued in Louisiana granted him legal status, but they could not erase the fundamental vulnerability of any black man in America, free or enslaved. The North offered better conditions than the South, but it was not the promised land that some imagined. Hella, the elderly enslaved woman who had delivered all 12 babies at Sacred Mercy, maintained contact with scattered members of the free black community throughout Louisiana and into neighboring states. She had been freed after the convent's closure, a condition Sister Jean Baptiste had insisted upon as part of her negotiation with the Archbishop, and she lived with her daughter Margot in New Orleans until her death in 1862. In the years before she died, Helen occasionally received news through the network of Free People of Color, news that filtered down from the North through travelers and letters, and the informal channels that connected Black communities across great distances. She told her daughter Margaret that she had heard Macias reached Cincinnati safely, that he found work as a carpenter, that he married and started a family. Whether this was true or simply what Helen wanted to believe remained uncertain. What is certain is that in the 1860 census for Cincinnati, there appears a listing for Macias Duval, mulatto, carpenter, age 37, living with a wife named Sarah and 3 children. The ages align with the man who left Louisiana in 1850. The profession matches, the name carries through. If this was indeed the same Macias, and the circumstantial evidence suggests it was, then he achieved what he had been denied his entire life in Louisiana. A family that bore his name, children who were born free rather than into bondage, work that he was paid for rather than forced to perform, and a community that recognized him as a man rather than property. He would have witnessed the Civil War from Cincinnati, would have seen the waves of refugees fleeing north as the conflict ground on, would have perhaps contributed to the war effort in whatever ways were available to Black men in Ohio. He would have lived to see slavery abolished, would have heard the news of Lee's surrender and Lincoln's assassination, would have experienced the brief hope of Reconstruction and its subsequent betrayal. Church records from St. Xavier Parish in Cincinnati show a Macias Duval attending Mass regularly in the 1860s and 1870s, serving on committees to assist formerly enslaved people who had fled north. A receipt book from a Cincinnati furniture workshop shows payments to M. Duval for custom carpentry work in 1871 and 1873. A marriage record from 1875 shows the marriage of Marie Duval, daughter of Macias Duval, to Thomas Freeman, laborer. These fragments suggest a life lived quietly, productively, in the kind of anonymity that allowed a man to build something permanent out of the wreckage of his past. If this was Macias, and the preponderance of evidence suggests it was, then he lived to the age of 61, dying in Cincinnati in the winter of 1884, the same year that Sister Jean Baptiste died in Alabama. His death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia, and noted that he was survived by a wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. The brief obituary in the Cincinnati Gazette described him as a respected craftsman and member of St. Xavier Parish, who will be missed by his family and community. There was no mention of Louisiana, no reference to Sacred Mercy, no hint of the 12 children he had fathered under circumstances he had no power to refuse. As far as Cincinnati knew, he was simply a freed man who had made good, one of thousands who had built new lives in the North. The building that had housed Sacred Mercy stood empty for several years after the closure, slowly deteriorating in the humid Louisiana climate. Local people avoided it, though whether from superstition or simple lack of interest was never clear. In 1855, it was finally purchased by a planter named Eshen Budrow, who converted it into a sugar processing facility. The chapel was stripped of its religious furnishings. The stained glass windows sold to a church in Baton Rouge. The altar dismantled. The building burned to the ground in 1867 during the chaos of Reconstruction. The cause was listed as unknown origin in parish records, though fires were common during that turbulent period and rarely investigated thoroughly. Some said it was Confederate sympathizers punishing Budrow for his cooperation with Union authorities. Others whispered that it was former slaves who knew enough about the building's history to want it erased. The truth, like so many truths from that era, disappeared into the smoke. The foundations remained visible for years afterward, slowly being reclaimed by the swamp. The cemetery at the far edge of the property survived, its iron fence rusting but intact, its stones marking the graves of sisters who had died before the scandal and of stillborn children from planter families. By the 1890s, even the foundations had disappeared beneath the relentless growth of Louisiana vegetation. The location of Sacred Mercy became a matter of speculation and fading memory. Old-timers in St. Martinville could point vaguely toward the north and say the convent was out that way somewhere, but precise locations were lost as the men and women who had known the place firsthand died off. The scandal that the archbishop had feared never materialized, at least not during the lifetimes of those involved. The story was told only in whispers, passed down within families who had reason to remember. Descendants of Helen who had delivered the babies, relatives of the sisters who knew something had gone terribly wrong, but could never learn the full truth. Members of the 12 families who had received the children and sometimes noticed peculiarities that didn't quite align with the stories they had been told. The church survived, as it had survived countless scandals before, through the time-tested strategy of silence, dispersal, and the systematic erasure of inconvenient evidence. The official records remained pristine, unmarred by any hint of impropriety. Sacred Mercy appeared in diocese and histories as simply another small convent that had operated for a brief period before financial difficulties forced its closure. Unremarkable, unmemorable, unworthy of further investigation. But the evidence persisted anyway in fragments. The bill of sale for Macias preserved in estate records. The baptismal certificates for some of the children with details that didn't quite match their supposed origins. The freedom papers issued to Macias filed with the parish courthouse, showing an unusual level of detail and an archbishop's signature on a document that normally would have required only a magistrate's approval. The letters of introduction, some of which survived in the archives of churches where Macias had presented them, asking for assistance in ways that suggested circumstances more complicated than a simple manna mission. These fragments remained scattered through archives and private collections, meaningless to most who encountered them, their significance understood only by those who knew enough to connect them to the larger story. And those who knew enough were, by design, scattered and silenced, bound by vows or by prudence to carry their knowledge to the grave. Somewhere in the cypress swamps of Louisiana, beneath the water and the rot and the endless cycle of growth and decay, lie the physical traces of Sacred Mercy, the bricks of its foundations, the iron of its fences, the stones of its cemetery. And somewhere in the bloodlines of America, in Louisiana and Texas and Ohio and California and places farther still, live the genetic descendants of what happened there, carrying within them the inheritance of 12 women who renounced motherhood and one man who was given no choice in his fatherhood. The scandal remained buried, as the archbishop intended. But the truth, like water finding its way through limestone, continued to seep through the carefully constructed barriers of silence. It emerged in family stories that didn't quite make sense, in genetic traits that appeared without explanation, in documents that survived when they should have been destroyed, in the stubborn human need to understand origins even when those origins are forbidden knowledge. Sister Jean Baptiste, writing in her isolated mission in Alabama, had understood this. She had written in one of her journals, "Truth is more persistent than power." We may bury it, may threaten those who speak it, may create elaborate structures of silence to contain it, but truth is patient. It waits, and eventually, in ways we cannot predict or control, it surfaces. Not always in the form we expect, not always when it can do the most good, but it surfaces nonetheless, because truth is what remains when all the lies have been forgotten. What happened at Sacred Mercy between 1845 and 1850 was a scandal born from the intersection of slavery, religious authority, human weakness, and institutional power. It was enabled by a system that made some people property and gave others absolute control over that property. It was perpetuated by isolation, by the particular psychology of closed religious communities, by the ways that transgression by one person makes transgression by others seem less impossible. It was covered up through threats and dispersal and the calculated erasure of evidence. But it was also, in its strange and terrible way, a story about resistance to that cover-up. Sister Jean Baptiste's refusal to let Macias be murdered was itself a form of resistance, imperfect, compromised, achieved through blackmail rather than righteousness, but resistance nonetheless. Her insistence that his life mattered more than the church's reputation challenged the fundamental logic of institutional self-protection that has governed powerful organizations since the beginning of recorded history. The 12 children born at Sacred Mercy grew up and had children of their own, and those children had children until the bloodlines dispersed across the country and mixed with others until tracking them became impossible. They lived ordinary lives, These descendants, some prospered, some struggled, some died young, some lived to old age. They were farmers and merchants, teachers and laborers, soldiers and ministers. They bore no mark of their origins, except in the subtle variations of feature and complexion that all humans carry as evidence of their complex ancestries. And somewhere in the north, in a cemetery in Cincinnati, there may lie the grave of Macias Duval, marked with a simple stone bearing dates that would have made him 61 years old at death. Exactly the right age for a man who was 22 when he was purchased for sacred mercy in 1845. Whether anyone who visited that grave knew the full story of the man buried there is doubtful. But the stone remains, as stones do, marking a life that was lived despite everything that tried to prevent it. A testament to survival, if not to justice. This is what we know of sacred mercy, assembled from fragments and testimony, from whispered stories and documentary evidence, from the stubborn persistence of truth, even in the face of institutional power determined to suppress it. The full story may never be recovered. Too many records were destroyed. Too many witnesses died with their knowledge. Too many threads lead to dead ends or ambiguities that cannot be resolved with certainty. But enough survives to know that something extraordinary and terrible happened in that convent in the Louisiana swamp. Something that the church tried desperately to erase, and that the eraser was only partially successful. The story persisted in fragments, in whispers, in the bloodlines of descendants who carried within them the genetic evidence of events their ancestors tried to bury. This mystery shows us that history's most carefully guarded secrets rarely disappear completely, even when the powerful deploy every resource at their disposal to ensure silence. Truth seeps through the barriers we construct around it, emerges in unexpected places, refuses to be completely buried. What happened at Sacred Mercy was hidden successfully enough that it never became the national scandal the Archbishop feared during the lifetimes of those involved. But it was not hidden successfully enough to disappear entirely. The evidence survived, scattered and fragmentary, but real. What do you think of this story? Could such a thing really have happened in the shadowed corners of American religious history, hidden behind the respectable facade of a teaching convent in Louisiana? Was Sister Zine Baptist's method of protecting Macias, blackmail, threats, the willingness to expose the church to scandal, justified by the circumstances? Or did she simply trade one form of coercion for another? And what do we owe to the descendants of those 12 children who lived and died without ever knowing the truth of their origins? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think about this complex story of power, guilt, survival, and the limits of institutional silence. If you found this exploration of a hidden scandal compelling, if it made you think about how power operates and who pays the price when the powerful seek to protect themselves, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates history's darker truths. The past is never as simple as we wish it were. And the stories that make us most uncomfortable are often the ones most worth remembering, because they teach us something essential about human nature and the structures of power that shape all our lives. See you in the next video.